Hello. I actually think that's topical because democracy is in crisis, right? Okay, so I'm Siddhu Pachipala. I'm a first-year undergraduate student. I'm studying political science and economics. And I want to start by launching us back into the 1990s. And that's a time before I was born. But I think there's enough media and talk that I can get a good picture of what it would look like. And from the peer-reviewed literature, I imagine that it's an age of dial-up internet, denim overalls, and in debating important questions like, were Ross and Rachel really on a break? But thinking about political science, as someone studying political science, the most salient feature of the 1990s seems to be this relentless political optimism among political types. Hope that, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Western-style liberal democracy, with its civil liberties, open markets, and accountable leadership in tow, would just sweep across the world and usher in an era of eternal peace. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history. But we're 30 years removed from Fukuyama, and we've strayed far from that rosy prediction. Across the world, fundamental freedoms are being swiped by the fistful. Charismatic autocrats are gaining steam, and the rule of law is fraying at the edges. This year marks the 18th consecutive year of global freedom decline and the erosion of liberal norms in 85 out of 173 countries. And our own country hasn't been spared from this trend. Our legislatures are historically unproductive. Public trust in our institutions is at all-time lows, and our constitutional principles, like the separation of powers and peaceful transfer of power, are every day weaker. Now, y'all came to hear about the future of computing, right? Not to hear about someone telling you that government isn't doing so hot. So what exactly is my point here? And to put it plainly, it's that a recent computing breakthrough, which is generative AI, could be on balance good for the fate of liberal democracy. But I wouldn't blame you for thinking otherwise initially, right? I mean, the images are practically seared into our memory. Facebook getting torn apart on the floor of Congress for pawning off 87 million users' data to Cambridge Analytica and swaying election results. Russian bots texting voters by the tens of thousands to not show up on election day. States deploying algorithms to gerrymander districts, playing arts and crafts until precincts look like dinosaurs. There's this underlying sense in American politics that technological innovation, particularly generative AI, is something that we're just going to have to deal with begrudgingly. It's this boogeyman we're going to spend the rest of our political lives regulating. But I'm convinced that there's incredible opportunity here, right? That we don't have to just withstand generative AI, but we can harness it in service of our democratic values. And by the end, I hope that you'll see it too. So there are three key pillars of liberal democracy that I and political scientists see are most wounded in 2024. First is a campaigning status quo that favors the wealthy and powerful. Two, there's widespread distrust in how votes are counted on election day. And three, there's poor accountability for politicians in office. And you're going to experience firsthand how generative AI, if implemented correctly, could be a powerful fix. You whip out your clipboard. It's the 15th door you've knocked on today, and you're already panting. Half out of exhaustion, half out of annoyance at the 45-minute screaming match you had with your neighbor about gun control ordinances. This election cycle, you're somehow supposed to balance a full-time job with managing an entire campaign against a decades-long incumbent. The party refuses to support challengers. So you're DIYing your own volunteer team, a makeshift digital marketing plan, and flyers with slogans. In November, you'll lose. But don't take it personally. In 2022, 94.5% of incumbents were reelected to the United States House. 100% were reelected to the Senate. Incumbent advantage, as it's known, has become a reliable fact of American politics. I've been in the campaign room with losing challengers. There's this overwhelming sense, especially among working class, outsider, and first-time candidates, that you've lost before you've even started. It's part of the reason why 2/3 of all seats go uncontested every election year, which spells out a big problem for liberal democracy, which relies on competitive elections that rely on real and not just nominal choice for citizens. But generative AI could level the playing field for you. You might not be able to do big televised debates or big billboard attack ads or massive fundraising campaigns, but you can expertly tailor your communications by sub-demographics and neighborhood groups. This is a little video ad targeting rural, working-class, lean-right voters in Indiana. It starts at a small, cozy diner. The air is thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. A group of young, working-class individuals sporting worn-out boots and baseball caps gather around a table, chatting and laughing. Isn't that just swell? And we can also see it in the sense that you can produce voter logs where individual campaigns should focus your attention to optimize your impact. You're probably familiar with these fundraising texts at this point. And you can imagine algorithmically calculated likely voter texts to help you fundraise in between meetings at work. But let's be real here. There's obviously potential for manipulation. And we've already seen dirty tactics with the tech of the past. And AI charges them with new capabilities. Most recently, we saw in New Hampshire, Democratic primary voters were called by Joe Biden, telling them to stay home and save their vote for November, which just isn't a thing, by the way. We're no stranger to hyper-realistic deepfakes. I was scrolling earlier today on Instagram, and I saw a video of Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump all playing Minecraft together, which just never happened. So that's just a fact of our political life now. But I think we do have a remarkable resilience and adaptive capability. We've already met generative AI content with community flags on Twitter. We have a nationwide sense of skepticism when it comes to viral audiovisual content, and we have increasingly accurate fake detectors. I think we stand at a fork in the road, and there are two clear paths forward. One option is to have the power concentrated among existing power. Big banks, insurance companies, and pharma giants already have access to powerful analytical tools, and this could cement that power. The other option is to democratize this kind of technology while we work and grapple with regulating its negative externalities. Today, running for office feels out of reach for many ordinary Americans. It feels less like the clash of ideas it's supposed to be, and more like a test of your institutional, financial, and capital. And I think one day generative AI could change that. Okay, flash forward. You've beat the odds and you have an enormously successful political career now. And you're Secretary of State for your home state, which means one of your big tasks is to manage elections in your state. And in 2024, I think that's an unenviable position when nearly a third of Americans believe the claim, thoroughly debunked by the media, by the courts, and by Trump's very own Election Integrity Commission, that Biden won the 2020 election with widespread voter fraud. But it doesn't really matter where the evidence stacks up in this case, because mistrust is mistrust. And it spells out a big problem for elections. And I think generative AI could be very powerful here. Today, poll workers do much of the vote counting by hand. They dig for irregularities in mail-in ballots. They scan in paper ballots. They do recounts and recounts of the recounts and audits of the recounted and determine if provisional ballots should be in. And it's here that critics say much of the fraud slips through the cracks. And with AI, it seems that election clerks could more accurately pick out irregularities and produce fraudless voter lists, which digital tabulators could then scan far more quickly than regular poll workers, hopefully producing less accusations of fraud, especially as the roster of swing states grows and races are becoming increasingly competitive. But the question is obvious: is this technically and politically feasible, right? Technically, we seem to have the capabilities. We already have companies automating the counting and auditing of paper ballots. And if government's going to not hop on the trend, it seems that conservative vigilantes already are. They're running through voter rolls, searching for fraudulent and undocumented registered voters. But again, let's be real. Cyber attacks are a feature of modern elections, and they threaten the personal information of voters and undermine trust in election results. But public opinion polling shows that if federal government took action working against cyber attacks and produced a strategy of co-deployment of manual and generative AI counting systems in tandem, humans checking computers and computers checking humans, we can improve on trust from all angles. Now, I'll let you retire from your Secretary of State job. You don't get a pension. And now I'm going to ask you to be the politically engaged citizens that you are, which shouldn't be hard because you're spending your weeknight listening to people talk about the future of computing. Aristotle famously once said that man is by nature a political animal, but most people don't have the time, energy, or will to be 24/7 full-time political animals. And it seems that here is where most of the disconnect between people and their leaders seems to emerge. Our leadership can't tell us all the time what's going on, and we can't listen all the time, so we resort to our elaborate system of middlemen. Broadcast personalities, party pundits, magazine op-eds, podcasts, social media feeds. And it's here where doubt becomes distrust, where skepticism becomes cynicism, and where partisanship becomes tribalism. But with generative AI, you could potentially get a more accurate morning briefing based on the things you really care about. You could figure out what your leaders in the State House in DC are doing and whether those roll call votes really align with what you want. You could learn about the provisions of the latest bill that's in committee, which are often hundreds of provisions long, and get them digestible and easy to read. But generative AI doesn't just have to play a role in education. It can be a powerful tool in holding our leaders to account. Many of us don't choose to call our representatives or engage in a regulatory agency's open comment period for rulemaking or organize movements in our own communities. But imagine a country where we could feed our policy preferences and values into bots that engage our leaders in a concerted way. We could then be as prolific as lobbyists in speaking our truth to elected officials. We can't be full-time political animals, but generative AI could potentially be a helpful surrogate. Again, let's be real, introducing a capability opens up room for others to take advantage, like when AI recently overwhelmed the Federal Communications Commission's open comment period by spamming it. But we project that technology develops in parallel, right? That the capabilities to defend against spam will advance just as the capabilities to deploy it will too. Okay, generative AI has the potential to breathe new life into our institutions' dying faith. And we should be more than willing to use it at this critical political moment, when democracy's fate in America has resounding repercussions for the fate of democracy worldwide. This year, more human beings will have the chance to vote in an election than ever before. Elections are happening in the United States, the European Union, India, Mexico, and more. Being a Luddite is always an option. We can stew in our fear, wave the white flag, sit paralyzed, think that generative AI is going to have bad implications, sure. Or we can, as many a generation before us have done, rise to the occasion. And figuratively, we can ask ChatGPT, how can we continue our 3-century legacy of we the people? And I am open to your questions.
Thank you, Siddhu. Thank you, Siddhu. Questions? Yeah, question from Mazia.
Thank you for your talk. The analogy to Luddites, right? The Luddites were not against technology. They were against their destruction and removal, their oppression via technology. And I think in the same way, many people are against the use of generative AI in forms of government, or more broadly, right, the general use cases, because they're concerned about misuse and erasure of certain people. So, we don't think that if we look at what open usage of deepfake technology is used for, it's not being used for social good. Right? And so when you give a tool to the masses, you can't always control how it's being used. And while we can sometimes amplify technology that addresses it, it's not always possible, right? And so if we look at, for example, use of deepfakes in generating underage pornography, it's very hard to go back and kind of detect all of that. So how do we ensure that when we democratize access to technology, it doesn't destroy people who are more vulnerable and maybe won't have the capacity to use it in the same way?
Right, I think that exactly was one of the biggest concerns I had when writing this paper. But I think potentially democratization could be the very boost marginalized voices need in a pluralist society, right? We have so many different interests that go into our democracy, but it seems that some of them have a more heavy-handed influence than others, right? Disproportionately, moneyed interests, disproportionate to their relative size in the population, right, have an influence on our politics, whereas the vast majority of people don't get to levy that same influence on our representatives, for example. So I think, while being careful of exactly what you mentioned, rolling out tools that could help detect deepfakes, or even having a blanket ban on having deepfakes with political candidates, things like that, we can ensure that we're delivering technology to the people that need it to kind of level that playing field of political voice without some of the repercussions you're thinking about. Thank you.
Hey, thanks. That was really interesting. My question is a little bit cynic, but who's developing those technologies? Is it private companies that really only care about their shareholders? Is it the government who's using technology from 50 years ago? Or is it government contractors who have shown themselves to be extremely corrupt? Like whose interest is it in to work on all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we're seeing with generative AI capabilities is that they're disproportionately, unlike other previous innovations, being developed by private industry. And I think there even is a profit interest in developing tools like this for the general body politic. There's so many consumers out there, right? We have the entire polity just waiting to access something like this. So I think it could potentially be a profitable move, but I guess I'm kind of banking on the fact that when a tool like a ChatGPT or a DALL-E 2 is released, it ends up kind of trickling down to the rest of us. Even my mom, who's not very good with technology, has ChatGPT on her phone, and she's able to use that. So I think via that kind of dissemination of technology, hopefully it gets in the right hands. Even if it wasn't intended to be used by everyone, it can get used by everyone.
Thank you again. It was a marvelous presentation, a really very thoughtful paper. So congratulations. I want to bring us back also actually to the 1990s, because I miss, those shows that you reminded us of very deeply. So it was actually in that exact same moment when a lot of people were heralding the brand new thing called the internet, or the World Wide Web, as a sort of unfettered space of democratic participation where every voice will be heard and people can find each other. And it kind of didn't really go that way, roughly speaking. Kind of went different ways. And so I wonder what lessons might we have from even a recent history to try to do, to avoid some of those sometimes quite glaring problems. You've hit on a few of them already, and I wonder, in what way would these most recent tools really be bringing kind of computational power to the masses if training the next generation of a GPT requires the energy equivalent of 1 to 2 dedicated nuclear power plants? That speaks to a concentration, a quasi-monopolistic concentration, as opposed to a kind of democratization of I can make my own specialty tool to target for good or for ill my neighborhood voters and all the rest. So how do we avoid the problems that history has shown seem to come up, more than once in recent memory? How do we get around the problem of black boxing, of opaque methods, of the so-called hallucinations, which are actually just lies, of totally fake citations? So sort of having the robots auto-summarize, very complicated legislation, and maybe even write it for that matter. What's the guardrail against just propagating more garbage in the system that's going to be actually overwhelming to try to detect, because no human can process it all? Thanks.
Wow. Yeah, so, okay, starting from the beginning. No, that was a great series of questions. I think one of the things that's noted about the rollout of the internet and about social media, which you said was heralded as going to be this great democratizer, was a hesitation to regulate, right? There wasn't really much regulation about what could be posted on the internet, about what social media company algorithms could do that have fed division and the kind of centralization of power. But I think by being more liberal with the regulation we're enabling ourselves to kind of apply to the situation, we could be a different story. And I think what you mentioned about we want to avoid that centralization of power that seems really likely when you need something that's very high compute. I think that again involves some governance structure that prevents these especially high compute models from going into the wrong hands. So again, I think it's a question of we just need to be thinking about what regulatory framework could we put this under to figure out how can we balance the values of democracy with also some safety and security, right? I can't quite remember what your last point was. Oh, hallucinations. I have to say, yeah, that's a big problem. It might be an improvement on what citizens think about legislation today, right? It's hard to say that we are really privy to what the context is in some of these huge bills that we can't really get into the nitty-gritty or don't have the time or will to. So even a hallucinated summary might be an improvement on the status quo.
So, great presentation. Thank you very much. Also, very refreshing to see some ray of optimism in this topic. As you illustrated in one of your slides, democracy is not binary. There is a wide spectrum. So, I was wondering how you think about which parts of the spectrum you think this technology might be more impactful. And in particular, many things we do as humans tend to make good things better and bad things worse. So how can we avoid this here?
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful ways that something like generative AI could be used, something that I didn't get to mention in the slides, is the power it has to increase deliberation. It could potentially, it's being looked into, be a moderator of deliberative discussions, which is kind of, the lack of which is kind of feeding into a lot of the polarization we're seeing now. The ability to not just have a heated exchange of insults and move toward genuine clarification of what the conflict is, kind of movement toward trying to find some common ground and consensus, that process could be facilitated by AI. And I think one of the most powerful ways AI could be used is maybe not so much analytical, that is definitely a big portion of it, but in the way that it can shape our culture, to be a more deliberative culture, to be a more thoughtful culture when it comes to the veracity of information. It's funny that we need something to come out that creates total lies for us to really reconsider what might be the truth. And I think that's an interesting implication.
All right. So one of the advantages that you pointed out was this ability to kind of amplify the people with not too many resources, make them allow them to compete head to head with the highly resourced groups. But then you also talked about how another advantage is that maybe we're going to be able to do much better detection of fakes and automatically generated content. And those two seem to be kind of contradicting each other, right? Presumably, if we get really good at identifying automatically generated content, then we're just going to be able to identify the automatically generated content that the little people use to amplify themselves and sort of filter that out and not listen to them, right? And certainly, a lot of political speech is not so much about content. It's more like peacock feathers, right? It's about showing, look how much money I'm able to collect. That means that I have, lots of important people behind me, and that's why you should vote for me, not necessarily the content of the message. And so it seems like if you can actually filter it out, then, don't we end up kind of in the same place where we started?
Right. I think that is a great check. The ability to detect AI-generated messages on the more person-facing parts of politics, using AI for that. Using AI, for example, as it's been used before, it's being tested right now, conservative politicians are trying to use AI to see, can we bring not just likely voters, but on-the-fence voters, and even unlikely voters onto our side by kind of posturing certain policy positions in a way that speaks to someone's values. Right, and I think being able to detect that kind of thing is really helpful here. And that's why I think AI lends itself generative AI lends itself especially well to the behind-the-scenes parts of a campaign, the analytics that you might consider to then do a standard reach out, for example, or even the blanket fundraising calls. I don't think anyone cares if that's AI generated. I think Nancy Pelosi's is AI generated, to be honest. So I think it's an important check on the more nefarious parts, the persuasive parts of the political enterprise. And I think that coevolution naturally of technologies and detection technologies is really helpful here.
I guess there's sort of two different ways of looking at it. One is that it's an arms race, and you have to run really fast to stay in the same place, because otherwise you get smaller. But that's quite different from saying, oh, this is going to be a net benefit.
Well, I think, like, for instance, the internet has also seen the same kind of arms race of trying to check some of its excesses over time. But I guess I'd be hard pressed to find someone who wants to go back, right? And well, I mean, like, there's some of y'all in there. Like, we have quite the diversity of people. But I think it's going to be hard to regress. Like, after it's introduced, it's going to be basically impossible to pull it back. But I think it could be on net good if the right regulatory framework's in place.